Prior to the dawn of democracy, there were very few opportunities for people living in townships to access quality, private healthcare at affordable rates.
It was difficult then to get into private practice because most private hospitals only admitted white patients.
You know, those days are apartheid days. Patients were allowed in the private hospital, but I was not allowed to go and see the patients there. At one stage, I was the only black specialist in this country in private practice. I was a pioneer going to white hospitals. I could see the reverse. That black doctor is here again.
Skilled black medical staff were employed at government and private hospitals far away from where they lived. And the community who required private healthcare services had to travel long distances to hospitals located in formerly white areas, often at considerable expense. In the late 1960s, a group of visionary businessmen, including Dr. G.M. Piche and Mr. Richard Maponya, under the leadership of Dr. N. Motlana, formed a company whose purpose was to establish a medical scheme and private clinic to serve the disadvantaged communities. In 1985, the group opened its first private hospital, Lesedi Clinic, now renamed Dr. S.K. Matseke Memorial Hospital, finally realizing their vision of bringing private quality healthcare to township areas. That led to the formation of the Clinics Health Group in 1992. It was the futuristic ambition of Dr. Peter Matseke that saw the current and continuing growth of Clinics Health Group to greater heights. Clinics also facilitated the advancement of previously disadvantaged doctors by enabling them to open their own specialist practices in these underserviced communities. 30 years later, Clinics continues the legacy by being a respected healthcare group consisting of 6 private, state-of-the-art hospitals located in Soweto, Johannesburg, Vosloorus, Vereeniging, and Mafikeng. Together, these hospitals have over 1,500 beds and 23 operating theatres. Facilities include ICU beds, 24-hour emergency units, renal dialysis, mental wellness services, and 24-hour urgent care. Clinics continues to attract top healthcare professionals, which enables us to meet our mandate of providing a high standard of healthcare products and services, quality patient care, and friendly service. Clinics is committed to providing economic opportunities by ensuring that procurement is outsourced to local businesses, supporting entrepreneurs and ensuring a bright future for all. We continue to be administered by a team of diverse and highly skilled medical practitioners who, being rooted in the community, know just what you need to thrive. Clinics Health Group. You are family.
Good evening, colleagues. It just stopped right in the middle. So yeah, this is another edition of our weekly webinars provided and brought to you by Clinics Health Group, where Can Health meet, and we are excited once more to be hosting this webinar as we bring in different healthcare professionals from different fields across the country. And we've been doing this for the past 2 years or so, since the pandemic, when we went into lockdown, and in the latter half of that year, we thought that we should have something, as we were not able to meet, some healthcare professionals staying at home and others were able to go to the hospitals. But we thought that we should have this platform to share, at that time, share information about COVID, but later just the general information about healthcare delivery in our country. And so we're excited that we are continuing to do this on a weekly basis, and thanks to all of you for always coming in large numbers to be part of this exciting program that we are able to bring on behalf of Clinics Health Group. So please note that these webinars are also streamed live on YouTube, so that whenever you want to go back and watch the past series, you can always be able to do so and remind yourself about what you watched, and also just to check some aspect that you might have missed And these meetings are also CPD accredited. We work together with the HPCSA, and so that at the end of the presentations, we upload your information, and you can be able to get your CPD points, whether you are with the HPCSA or the Nursing Council or any other regulatory body like Pharmacy Council. So this evening, we're excited to be bringing to you one of our colleagues. I've worked with her for many years, and when I was in the public sector, met her and engaged with her, and continue to engage with her. That's Miss Sarah Davids, who's by training an occupational therapist and has worked with a number of NGOs, and currently they are based at the Western University of the Western Cape. And Sarah Davids introduced coaching into the health NGO space whilst managing the Wellness for Effective Leadership, the WELL program, a very uniquely South African personal leadership development process under the auspices of the esteemed Health Systems Trust that reached 1,500 public sector managers nationally. And the findings are summarized in a chapter of the South African Health Review, one of the books that are quite important for anyone in healthcare to access, many chapters or editions that one can access. She also has experience in coaching entrepreneurs, senior executives, couples, academia, middle managers, and community groups, educators, and learners. And she runs individual and group sessions with a national cohort of medical scholarship students. She's experienced in project and program design, facilitation, implementation, and scale up when the context informs the content and the nuances and approaches of health delivery. She has successfully engaged with a range of stakeholders. You'll see that she's quite an experienced healthcare professional and activist, and contributed to capacity enhancement and policy development within the healthcare sector. She currently convenes an online module for the University of the Western Cape with a focus on the health management, and that's why we invited her to come and talk to us about this important topic, an intriguing topic also, what I wished I knew as a health professional during my undergraduate training. So she'll take us back to the days of undergraduate training and look at what we're doing now and see whether we are competently trained and capacitated to be dealing with our day-to-day lives as healthcare professionals. And so it's a great pleasure to welcome you, Mr. Davids, to our platform at Clinics. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Bila, for that warm welcome, and thank you for those on the call. Yeah, and as you noticed, the first question that arrived is greet in your own language, or your language that your elders that you use. And I use that mainly because when we're in a professional space, we tend to forget that we're more than professionals. We have many roles in our lives and in society. So whilst I am waiting for it to load, there we go. I do want to invite you to use the chat. Stop me if you need to. Use the Q&A. And we look at this a bit like a story. So just following on from clinics being established, was the first hospital came in 1985. That was the first year I started university. And the funny thing, just to relate to that story, is I was the only Black student at UCT doing OT. And it was the most horrific experience. And the only friend I could remember was the one with red hair. So it was a bit of reverse. If I think back of it, I was suddenly thrust into this sea of whiteness. And the only person I recognized was the one with red hair. So she became my first friend. So this just gives you an idea of where we come from. So one of the first points I want to make, and I know you've just come from a series of NHI webinars. And one of the people in education that I always refer to, again, is Paulo Freire. And he was an adult education specialist, but also an educator and activist. And it's true then, in the 40s, and it's still true today. And one of the key things to remember is that all our education, even our webinars, is never neutral. And that whatever educational material we get is designed to either empower people to become critical, creative, and active, or we're there to maintain the status quo. And this is a delicate balance that we need to become aware of as we go through our training or as we train others based on where we are. And I'm reminded of a story. I think one of the first things we learned in OT, they said, put on candles for ambience. And I was the only one who said, but actually, some of us use candles for light. We don't have time for ambience. Only later on did I discover the value of ambience. But that just shows the expectations that we have and that the education has shifted. Yes, the kind of training has shifted, and we've tried to adapt over the last 30 or so years in terms of making it more relevant to the learners. But one of the key things that is equally applicable today, as well as in my journey, is to remember that unless the education or the things that we're doing are relevant to learners and they can feel it and they can understand it, can they make a difference? One of the things I often tell the medical students is we're quick to say, change your diet. But one of the questions we forget to ask before, and especially when we're dealing with chronic illnesses and high blood pressure and all of those, is the first question should be, what do you have in your pantry? What foods do you have at home before we give the nutritional advice? And those are some of the things that A, we weren't taught, but B, we've discovered and learned as we go along. Yeah. So quickly I learned that, and I'm drawing on the words of Nancy Klein, which says that thinking for yourself is a radical act. And I often say that through our training and through my experiences, we've learned, and we refer to it as the triple oppression. So in nursing, depending on the amount or your rank, there's a subtle way of looking down upon people, from an EN to a professional nurse to a matron, and depending on the training. And these are things that we need to question and we need to become aware of in our day-to-day engagements with our staff. So why we need to think about thinking is that the quality of everything we do today depends on the quality of the thinking we do first. And that's part of the planning. So whether you're running a unit, whether you're dealing with a patient, or which is why the NHI has taken so long. So those of you been in the NHI webinars or series recently, the concept of the NHI actually was formulated at a meeting in Mozambique in about 1990. And if you think about it, it's now 2023. So the bones of the NHI was already decided then. So a lot of the planning and the thinking are only things that are coming through now. So one of the actions I would challenge you all to do is to schedule a meeting with yourself. So you put it in your timetable, meeting with self, so that you protect time to think. Because as health practitioners, we cannot show up and lead and do our best if we don't reflect on what we've done, what has gone before. And one of the other things I realized is, so when I was working at, I always tell people I grew up in a psychiatric hospital, which means I started working at Lentegeur Hospital. And the only people I can't work with are people with diagnosed personality disorders. Everything else is possible. And when I complained and I said the quality of your students from UWC are not up to scratch, somebody turned around and said, well, do you think you could do better? And I said, yes. And they said, okay, come and teach here with us. And that's how I embarked on the teaching journey. But even before then, a lot of the management that I learned was not from the managers or my peers. It was the assistants in the system. And I remember an older, he was an OT assistant. He called me in one day and he said, Sarah, sit down here. And I said, yes. He said, they may be your same age. You might like all these people, but actually you're in charge. At some point, you must make the decisions. So that is an example of managing up, where people in the system guide and teach. And those are things that I still encounter in engaging with medical students, because I guide them to say, it's the nurses who've been there, it's the doctors who've been there, it's the staff who've been there that are the best teachers as you go along. And the phrase I have shifted to lean towards is that everybody at every level of management, we have the privilege of dealing with human potential. Everybody we engage with is where we can build or we can break. And I'll give you some examples of the challenges that medical students still find today across the country. So we think is automatic, but actually it's not. Nancy Klein has written a book. There's a link to a PDF, which I will give you on this, that you can explore further, or you can just Google it. So in order to think better, there are many principles, there are many areas that we need to think about. So this is just a little graphic that I'm showing you. Not too clear, but this might be one that's a little bit clearer. So part of what we needing to do is to pay attention. And as an undergraduate, you tend to only pay attention to passing, to making the grade. And a lot of the things that we needing to do with students, but also in the workplace, is how to listen without interruption. And a lot of what we're doing at the moment is people are talking to us, but the first thing we're doing is, while we're listening to them, we are busy with the cell phone. Yeah. So we're paying attention here and we're paying attention there. And these are huge challenges to listening. Again, it's about treating others as thinking peers, which means that giving people space to think. And that's often not encouraged. So, and particularly in the public sector, people have been conditioned not to question, but to accept. And one of the other things that you can see it's about creating, you have to create the space. And to a large extent, it's not a space for, and I try not to use the word safe space, but rather use the word a courageous space. Because in a team and where we work, we don't often have the space for our opinions to be heard. And what we're finding now is the cohort of people. So you've got many people working in the space. So there's the Generation Z, the younger ones, the older ones, and the whole spectrum. And being able to not assert authority based on your culture, based on your age, and getting the younger people to also say, there's a difference when you're at home, and there's a difference when you're in a professional space. But you are all of those things. So these are all tips on how you create spaces to listen, How do you encourage people and allowing people to share feelings? Yeah. So I'm not going to run through all of them unless we need to at a later stage. But I am going to share this with you. So one of the key things I learned, and not at university, it was actually outside of university, and it was part of the health activist movement. If I think about it, we spent a whole Saturday afternoon unpacking the principles of primary healthcare. And I can tell you, up until today, nothing that I do does not go back to these principles. Your A's, your E's, your affordability, availability, accessibility. So all of those are the principles. And these are the principles that inform whatever area we engage with. So as an undergraduate, I didn't, this didn't feature. This came afterwards. It was just do the work, make the grade, find, pass, tick the boxes. This mural is actually in Albertina Sisulu Road on the way to the airport. If you know Johannesburg and you're coming down Albertina Sisulu, this was done by a group of people, homeless people, together with an artist. And it's significant because it captures the concept of Ubuntu, as you see. And this, I use this slide because that's what we do within the medical professionals and in the medical field, is we have to remember and to go back that why we're here is to actually deal with the people. Yeah, it's the people that we serve that are important. Again, it's because of what I didn't know. And maybe if I can invite you to share some of the things that you wished you knew. And I wish to a large extent that these concepts were the pillars on which our health training happened, irrespective of the discipline. And these are only 5 dimensions of Ubuntu. There is a link. If we've got time, I'll run through some of those links with you. But this was done by a Professor John Folming. And the concept of Ubuntu is no longer South African. It's an internationally they've embraced this. There are organizations in Spanish, in people in Norway, all over the world that look at how do they integrate and apply these aspects of Ubuntu within their work. So again, this is an African concept that has gone global. And from the introductory video, you can see some of those elements exist within the founding of the clinics group. So our training doesn't necessarily always provide things around self-knowledge or self-confidence. And self-knowledge is about knowing yourself and what you like, what you don't like. Self-confidence is about how you show up in the world. Then there's the elements of resilience, empathy, and service. And here, when we're looking at service, he addresses something called servant leadership. So I'll encourage you to take a look and share these, perhaps in your teams and where you work. And just bring us back to our roots, because as healthcare providers, we have a significant influence on the people that we live and work with. Yeah? Okay. So I'll pause a bit while you read that. So grief. Grief is central. And grief is not just when people die. Grief is when friendships end, when you're questioning your judgment, when you're feeling lost and unanchored, and losing traditions. So often the medical students that shift between provinces to different universities, they experience a lot of this because they're not there to engage with the traditions that they would normally do had they stayed back home. Yeah. And this is another important curve to understand, and it links with grief and every change that happens in our life. Yeah. There's some kind of loss. And those of you who are familiar with the Kubler-Ross model, you go through that denial, anger, bargaining, and eventually acceptance. So the stages of grief are the stages that apply when you work, when you enter a new job, when they introducing the NHI. This is exactly what is going to happen. And this is what we're seeing happening in society. There's first denial, oh, don't worry, the NHI won't come. Then there's frustration, but it means we've got to adapt our policies, we've got to adapt the way we work. We just kind of got this grouping going, and now this is messing up our policies and all our areas. So any change, and even if we think about the pandemic has given us challenges, but it's also given us gifts. And part of the gifts, one of the gifts I can easily identify that has come from this particular group is the gift of using a virtual platform in order to remain connected and to remain engaged and to share information. Without that, it might not have fast-tracked as we have done. And I refer back to this because this is what happens when people engage with when as a student you engage with your first lot of patients, when you shifting blocks, when you having to deal with different supervisors, different styles. There's this constant shift. And this shift we can understand in a term called VUCA. Now, VUCA it's a bit old now, but the concept was used first in business, but it can also equally apply to health systems and health system strengthening. So within your workplace and within a student's environment, there's often a lot of volatility. That's what the V stands for. There's a lot of uncertainty. Uncertainty, what's going to happen next? So if you think back to your most recent NHI series, there's the documents go forward and backward. There's uncertainty in terms of clear direction. And there's also it's very complex. So the whole system, the C stands for the complexity. And again, the ambiguity. Now, not having a frame like this to understand makes the experience as a student and as a student still today, they have nothing to hold on to. So in one way, we need to say, these are the frameworks. It's okay for you to feel and experience the range of emotions. What you see in the green blocks are strategies or suggested ways where one can deal with the volatility. So when things are constantly changing and you're dealing with people with all these feelings that flip between denial, frustration, depression, it's important to have a clear vision. When there's a lot of uncertainty And again, this uncertainty can be where there's no clear decisions being made. Then perhaps exploring ways of understanding what is happening and having conversations. And that is why taking that time out to think is very important. So these were not things that we were taught as students. You have to think, you have to operate on principles, and these are, things that we try and reflect upon and only learn in hindsight. When there's a lot of complexity, and again, you can apply this to your recent webinar, your recent series of webinars on NHI. What do we do with all of this? We look for clarity. What is the one thing I know? What is the one thing I understand? What is the one thing I can focus on? So clarity is key in your communication, but also in getting us something jointly to focus on. And that clarity pulls us from that depression to enable us and give us permission to experiment and do things differently. So a lot of what we were taught as in our undergraduate years, there's only one way to go. And what we've realized is policies change, protocols change, treatments change, and therefore the only thing that is constant is change. So when things are ambiguous, the ambiguity that exists in society, so it goes against what you were taught. So you're either right or you're wrong. We're not often taught to look at the black and the white. It's this or it's that. And what we need to invite into our space is things called polarities, where you can imagine what is the worst thing and what is the best thing in your head, and acknowledge that on that line and on that spectrum, different people sit. So when you're making, even when you may be having team meetings and there's decisions that need to be made, different people sit on different lines or different places on that little spectrum. So that's the VUCA. So where are we now? Where would we like to be? How will we get there? So these questions I introduce because they're questions that provide a framework of thinking. They're also questions that are part of your quality improvement methodologies that are being used and that are also form part of lean management. And what we've done or not done sufficiently, what I didn't experience, but what we're trying to do now is to integrate some of the thinking principles as undergraduate students. Okay, so right now I'm dealing more with the postgrads, but these are the kind of questions, and even people who are in the health system, these are, and working, these are key questions that can be applied anywhere. Another set of questions that I try and ask people is, even in this webinar, you're listening to the what I'm saying. The next question that should be in your head is, so what does this mean to me? She's talking here for 30, 40 minutes. What does this mean to me? And the third question also again is, now what can I do about it? And just asking 3 simple questions can raise the awareness, raise how we show up, and raise how we interact and engage with the world. And again, a lot of our work was didactic and training, and this is a different way of being and doing in the world. Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this. Ideally, I'd throw you out and say, let's have a discussion about this. But every stage of my career was because there was something missing. So even before that, before you engage with that. So I worked as an OT, then I realized, now there's something missing with the training. I did some management work, then I did some clinical work. When I did training, even at the university, I realized what OTs can't be trained on their own. So in the community, we had dentistry students, OTs, physios, everybody doing community practice together. So that's when we developed the first cohort of primary healthcare across all disciplines, because nursing was doing PhD, we were doing PhD, and in the end, we combined those things. So every phase of my journey has been, what else am I missing? I'd been involved with HST as part of then was the initiative of sub-district support. That's when we started looking at all of the health system components. So whether it was health information to TB to pharmaceuticals, procurement, and our support to districts, sub-districts, and district management, and using the context to inform the policy of the country. So we went through that phase. What we don't do, or what we don't do enough of with students, is to acknowledge that they actually also come with skills. What I found very useful recently in the last year is the group of medical students I coach is we exchange. So they far more au fait with AI than what I am. So I bring in my set of skills and they teach me ChatGPT and Bard, and they come up with, but did you hear of this? And watch this video. So there's an exchange. And what I'm saying, there's a shift now to having to understand that we need to engage with the student body a lot more than what we currently or historically have done. Because, and that goes back to some of these principles. So I moved to do more formal coaching when I realized, but I was doing coaching anyway. I just didn't have a piece of paper. So I did the coaching. Then I thought, no, but there's still something missing. And what was missing is the system part of coaching, but also understanding of systems. So when we train and when we were trained, we get trained in terms of clinical content and competencies. And there's nothing wrong with that. That is important. But what we often miss is the context. And what I've learned through the Center of Right Relationships, which is, and we've got a grouping called OSC Africa, are the basis of relationship systems principles. So it's not just your IQ, it's not just your emotional intelligence, but it's also the social intelligence. And it's not only the cultural intelligence. And there was some demonstration of the cultural intelligence that you can harness when you ask people and invite the diversity into the group. So as a student, there was never an invitation to diversity. It was still part of that unsaid period where you had 1 or 2 Black students in the class, and the reason why they were there was to tick the box. Little did they know they had the most radical one in their team. But yes, so it's key to remember relationship system principles, and this applies equally to your relationships with your significant other as well as your children. And the key thing to remember is that your relationship system, and it's a relationship system is the space in between, if you think about it like that. Yeah, there's a person, so there's Dr. Bila, there's me, and there's a relationship with us, between us. Dr. Bila and his significant other, there's a relationship. So there's different relationships between different people. But when we can change our lens, our way of viewing the world, then we can also change our way of being. And the principles are this. So if you think of your workspace, Each relationship system has its own unique identity and personality. What's happening at your unit and your hospital is very different to what's happening at a different clinic. The next principle that I want to share with you and that you can be aware of is that everybody has a voice. Everybody in the team is a voice of the system. So I like this because it leans into democracy. And what we tend to forget, even in meetings, is that unless you do a round, if you have an issue on the table, unless you do a round and ask everybody's opinion, you'll always hear the loud ones or those who are more vocal than others. But often the wisdom lies in the quieter ones. And that's key to remember, that you must invite the quieter voices in your meetings, in your engagements, in the webinars. And remember that each relationship, if you believe that when you ask people, what do you think? Often you'll be surprised at the responses, and that when you trust the process, you'll find that people are able to generate their own solution. Now, remember that the roles that people play and the roles that you play within your team, within your system, the roles belong to the team. You are not the CEO. You are just the CEO is a role that belongs to that. Your unit manager is a role that belongs to the unit. You are not your role. Yeah. And as I said, everything is constantly changing and emerging. And it's a different lens to view the world. So that's why I'm sharing that. These were not things I knew or could access or understand, which led to a lot of frustration as a student. Yeah. So I'm going to give you some of the voices. So even today, and I've been working with a cohort of students from probably for the last 4 years. So they're all scholarship students. They've been blessed being able to engage with a coach and being able to do both individual and group sessions. Now, again, this raises a question for me. Why only the scholarship students and why not nationally? So a lot of the issues that are still coming through, and again, I link it back to my experience, but also right now, what's happening now. There's a lot of pressure from others to achieve. And there's a lot of sense of, I'm not good enough. Often the medical students were channeled to, because they had the top marks, they're the first people to come to university in the family, still today, 2023. They're the first cohort of people who've made it into a university. They are thrown by the varied cultural practices. They're young. They're having to deal with a lot of loss. And there's lots of triggers that happen. And one of the key things that happen in terms of triggers are things about their first experience of death, or whether, and it can happen in many forms, and particularly within their clinical training setting. Not just for medical students, but also for all of the students. People find patients that they identify with, or that look like a parent, or that look like a friend, or that sound like them. And these are things that they find very challenging. And they're needing to be supported on how to deal with them. One of the interesting things that still exists and that we don't talk about, I term it the isms. So it's your sexism, your racism, all the other isms. And there's a link that I'll include at the end. And this link, interestingly enough, was shared by one of the MPH, Masters for Public Health students. So again, based on what I didn't get, I try and change when I get the opportunity to teach. And one of the things I've asked them towards the end of the module is, what am I still missing that you think the next cohort will need? And this is of particular interest, because it's the bias you do not see. And that is things that you share at home and label as a toxic work environment or toxic teams, whatever words or language you use. But there are spaces where people feel they are still discriminated against, either on age, on gender, on women who come back from maternity leave and suddenly get asked, but why can't you come on time, where the flexibility is not there. So these are the kind of biases that we still perpetuate, knowingly, consciously, or unconsciously. And then often there's lots of conflict. And with students, we still have a high rate of suicide, which is unacceptable in residences. I've often had people call me and say, I don't want to talk to Sadag. I need to talk to you. I just fetched somebody. I was the first person there when my neighbor in the neighboring room committed suicide. And then, so these are stark and harsh realities that we're having to deal with. As medical students exiting, a lot of the challenges and the general questions, so I've separated them into a separate cohort of final year students. And a lot of that becomes, how do I manage? We've got all these finance companies coming and promising we must take this credit card and this gold and this black. And so finances are key. And those are not things we address. How do they manage? They come from being a student to being overwhelmed with these promises. They are engaged with and struggle with the peer pressure of, when you graduate, you must have this fancy car. And in some of the universities, they all drive around with their fancy cars in the parking lot after graduation. So there's all these kind of practices that have happened traditionally that they have to question and say, where do I fit in? What do I want to do? Yeah. So a lot of the themes that we're still not dealing with is, students are human. They have breakups, they have makeups, they have stress, they have depression, they have anxiety. And these are ways that we need to be able to build in, even when you see them practicing at your hospital, your new recruits, your old recruits, your people that exist. And this is something that I found as a solution. There's a book and there's videos on this, and this is called The Agreements for Engagement. And this is written by somebody called Don Miguel Ruiz. And what's interesting about this is I did this with my girls 10 years ago. No? And it's amazing how they hold me accountable. And if we can introduce things like this into the system for your students, for your staff, and this is that thing of be impeccable with your word. Oh, one of the other things that are also the isms that is still happening is the perceptions of students that come from rural areas and them engaging and having to deal with a white supervisor and getting them to understand that, because they come from and they've been indoctrinated and by their family situation. And a lot of this is, how do we open our eyes and say, and this is where the Ubuntu helps, because we get to see everybody as people. But I digress. So what does it mean? Number one means speak your truth. Number two, which is very difficult for all of us even today, is don't take anything personally. So when something happens, it's not you. Yeah, it is the situation. Don't make assumptions. Always do your best and be critical, but learn to listen. So an example of this is I'd be driving down the street with my girls in the car, and I'd have a friend next to me, and I'll be having a conversation, and I'll hear them pipe up, "Mommy, don't make assumptions. Mommy, you're taking things personally." So if they can learn it if they could learn it at primary school level, these are ways of being that we can introduce. Also, it applies with students, because then we eliminate cheating or attempts to take chances. But it also gives people a guiding framework on which to operate. Yeah. I do want to, I wish maybe I can show you some of these questions. Permission to share. I've seen this book in exclusive books now. This person is called Dr. Gabor Mate, and he talks about healing. The book that's that we've got access to right now in the country is author of The Myth of Normal. And I'm encouraging all the students to read it, but also everybody, because there's lots of videos, even if you don't like reading books. I'm wondering if I can stop share and maybe just give you a little bit of insight into, or a little bit of video on that. If we have time, which I think we do. Or if there's any questions in the meantime while I get the video to play. Are there any questions? Give me a sec. I should just click on the link. Give me a sec. Whoops, sorry about that. If there's any questions, you may unmute and share.
I just want to ask you, to anybody who's listening, who, whether it's health anxiety because they had a mom, to anybody who's listening, sister developed cancer or died prematurely, whether it's health anxiety because they had a mom,
Sorry.
we have just cancer issues.
Sorry, people.
What are tangible things? Because not everybody has access to healers.
I want to just make sure that I've shared sound in a minute.
Yeah, we had sound there.
Oh, you did have sound. Sorry about that.
Yes.
Let me just go
Yeah,
back
we do have
there,
sound.
because I think it's a really key video. Okay, let's go.
The type of healing that I do. What are tangible things maybe some of our listeners can do to process some of the trauma, some of the
Excuse me, you still have to share your screen. We can't see the video.
Oh. Sorry.
A healthy way.
Thank you for that. Give me a sec. Share sound. Let me just go back a little bit. Perfect.
You have just people struggling with anger issues. What are things, what are tangible things? Because not everybody has access to healers, to the type of healing that I do. What are tangible things maybe some of our listeners can do to process some of the trauma, some of the repressed anger and emotions that exist in our body that are making us sick, in a healthy way?
Well, let me follow the course of your statement as best I remember it from the beginning. Okay, so first of all, beginning with the conversation between you and Jamie. Oh, when is it too much and so on, and can you go too deep? Okay, and when is it over? So there's two answers to that question. Okay, first is I've talked about this publicly before, but I've written my own epitaph. You know, engraved on my gravestone. You know what it's going to say? It's going to say it was a lot more work than I had anticipated. That's what it's going to say. You know, because healing.
Step into Wix Studio. Then
I stopped playing. I'm not sure if that was the end.
I'm aware that I'm encroaching on your time. So I'm wondering if we mustn't just stop. You will get the link as we go.
Okay.
And I'm wondering if we mustn't just open for some questions or some comments.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. We can do so. We can. And thank you very much for sharing your thoughts on this topic. And I think I like that lastly the agreements that you say that one should be making. And the VUCA concept is quite something that, you know, in this world of volatility, sometimes it's difficult to navigate our way through our professional careers. And I think this agreement for engagement, it's something that one could apply in not only as students, but in our day-to-day activities. There was something that you didn't mention it, but I think about some of the things that we carry from our days, from our communities and through our student lives. That you spoke about, you were the only Black student, you know, in a class of white students. But is it possible that sometimes either yourself or some of your colleagues could be bringing something called unconscious bias into your workspace even today, and that affects how you relate to your colleagues?
Yes, I do think that it did initially. But I think what it did also is when you become aware of it, I think for a long time I was very angry. But as one matures and tries to make sense of this, you start realizing there's value in everybody. And that's where the Ubuntu comes. When you phrase and you look at Ubuntu, you embrace all. So I think it's a phase that you go through. With that anger, and I think it's exactly that anger, denial. Why am I the only one? Why is there nobody else? So whatever that curve was, I felt that range of emotions. And I think over the years, one works through that, and I had to be able to say, now, what is the value? What is the value add? Without that, I would not have become who I am. The turning point for me actually was I did a block in rural KZN. It was Manguzi Hospital. I was in my 3rd year. And the turning point came there. And I'm still friends with the people from that hospital from the time I was 20. I'm now 56. I've still maintained those friendships. And the reason why is I was suddenly in a place where there was no equipment. I had to draw on all my resources, my skills, and my knowledge, and try and engage and apply. And that, for me, was the turning point, is also seeing that there's other people that one could learn from. So I think one looks past all the, you start looking at people and not at color. And that is an important thing, an important transition to do. Yeah.
There's a comment here that says, thank you very much for the presentation. Good evening, sir. As a medical student, I enjoyed a lot of discrimination from both my peers and teachers. To such an extent, I abuse alcohol to cope. How can we address such discrimination and abuse from the teachers? How can we empower our medical students and junior doctors? Because this goes beyond undergraduate stage, even during internship, community service, and registrarship, doctors still endure such abuse. Hence, most of us do not even consider specializing. For medical students, are there any systems in place to address any reported abuse from either peers or teachers.
Yeah. So I think what is key, what we need to advocate for is to set up peer support groups and coaching, because the people that, and I tell them, it's not something to be proud of that you worked for 20 hours. It shouldn't happen. There's something wrong with the system if you are working 20 hours and telling me that you can still deliver quality of care. So that is the opportunities when the abuse, and it's alcohol abuse, it's all kinds of abuse. It could be drug abuse, it could be many other things. So yes, people are looking for coping mechanisms. When somebody shares and you notice that, that is a cry for help. That is a cry of self-medication. I'm trying to cope. So it's acknowledging that, yes, I've tried to cope. This is how I've tried to cope. But as healthcare providers, we have to look after these young ones that come into the system that we want to nurture. And we have to be confident and competent enough to say, it's okay to work myself out of a job. I have to teach this person as much as I know. So for me, the abuse that happens is ingrained in the system because we're silent about it. The abuse that happens in terms of time, in terms of how we allocate or misallocate time, is something that we give permission to do because others did it to us. We don't stop and think and say, in doing this action, am I maintaining the system which I spoke about at the beginning with Paulo Freire, or am I transforming the system? Because ultimately, it's not just about our colleagues in the training, but it's delivering the quality of healthcare we need for the patient. So yes, I'm really sorry that you've had that experience, but if we can advocate to build in the system support, and that kind of support must be part of everyone's training. I hope, I trust I've answered that question.
Yeah, and I think you did cover it well. And the next one, it says, thank you very much. We never stop learning as health professionals. Most of us are wounded healers.
Correct.
And we come with huge expectations, and at times the expectations are not met. We need to embrace others. However, we also need to embrace ourselves as well. I think you spoke about it.
When we did this Wellness for Effective Leadership program with HST, which I wish we could continue, because then we work with team and we acknowledge the woundedness in all of us. And the woundedness doesn't come because of necessarily trauma, but it becomes because a lot of people in the health system have chosen, not because they chose it, but nursing was often the only profession that paid, nursing and teaching. So if the household needed income, somebody could go, you could train and get paid. We didn't have money. So there's a lot of that challenges. There's a lot of issues that come up that we don't talk about, which is the black tax that happens, where the people who are working are supposed to be supporting all these, the rest of the family. So those are the underlying things that affect how we show up in the workplace and in engaging, and ultimately that affects the patients. So yes, this wounded healers is key. So I would encourage you all to watch some of the things around Gabor Mate, because he talks in a way that is understandable, and his book is very, very simple. Yeah. Other questions?
Yeah. But talking to, just asking, talking to professionals today, and I think the topic says what I wished I knew. What is it that perhaps that lingers on in your mind primarily, looking back at your days as a student and looking back at where we are? Do you find that healthcare professionals are happy with general medical doctors, nurses, pharmacists? If they were to wind the clock, generally, are we where we would love to be? Would we be happy with the chosen path of our professional careers, or does data indicate that we'd rather be doing something else?
No, I think Yeah, that's a bit of a catch-22. One of the other research that was done, and that we also, I think Vit started it and it went up Africa, is helping healthcare workers learn. And that was about asking, why did you become a healthcare worker? And you find that although those things might have been the initial reason why people came, people come and they love the profession, irrespective of the profession. So one of the key things that enables or facilitates change is exactly what you're saying, is when you identify what's my passion right now. If my passion is to serve people, then it's that passion that you access, not the fact that you're working overtime or you did that thing wrong. So I try and advocate people and say, before you do anything, catch people doing things right. Find something to compliment them on. It doesn't matter where you go, whether you're going to a meeting, for a performance meeting, or whether you're just walking into the clinic. Comment about something nice. Oh, the windows are open. That's very nice because the airflow prevents the TB germs from flowing. This looks nice. So it can be anything. But our attitude and the way we show up is to catch people doing things right and doing nice things. Compliments are one of the biggest challenges. So even when we did that well training, the biggest cry for people in the system was, nobody compliments me and acknowledges me to say I've done something right. Again, I go back to the greetings. In KZN, I often say, explain to me, what does Sawubona, Sanibona means? It doesn't mean hi, hello. It means I see you as a person. I see you. I see all of you. And those are the roots that we have to go back to. And that is why I asked the first question, greet in the language. There's a reason why we grew up in that way. There's a reason why we use that language. Not everybody grew up speaking the same language. Some people just grew up speaking English, but understanding and being sensitive to when you greet people, you already know a lot. But we have to put down the cell phone, look into their eyes, listen to them. And that for me is key. Yeah. Whether it's a student, whether it's your children, whether it's your significant others. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe the last question for me, I don't see if there's anyone who's got a question. Please don't hesitate to unmute yourself and ask a question. But, you spoke about volatility. I mean, the healthcare environment is quite volatile at the moment. And it's because of because there's more patients are quite aware of their rights. And I think what has happened in the USA about litigations, doctors are quite about, aware of, when you see patients, by nature of the business of the profession, something may go wrong. And if anything goes wrong with the slightest mistake or slightest error of judgment, patients are prone to go and consult their lawyers. Does this make healthcare professionals very uncertain and unhappy, or when you wake up in the morning, are you quite eager to go to work and say, well, I faced the day without any comebacks about what I do, even if I've got a passion to do it?
Correct. I think perhaps we must rephrase both the question and invite people to, if you know your work, if you're confident and competent with your skill set, it is important, and part of the transformation and part of the legislation is getting the patient's voice. So that's a global push in terms of quality improvement. In terms of 2 years ago, we had a national movement around getting the patients' voices. If we encourage them, but we use a statement that every right, there's a responsibility. And that's what we forget. We talk about rights, but we don't teach responsibility. So if you are able to educate and say, this is my right, but this is the responsibility I hold. So as a healthcare practitioner, I have rights and responsibilities. The patient has rights and responsibilities. And if we're able to balance those two, then we're better to engage and not navigate and operate on a level of fear-based. I can't do this in case they. But to say, come, let me teach you. This is what we are doing and this is why we're doing it. The education is, yes, it is risky. All operations are risky, but we have success in our unit, in our hospital. We've got the evidence-based medicine to prove. So it's about engaging and that I see you and I listen to your needs. And I try and tell the students, when you first have an interaction with the student, with the patient, and you delivering a diagnosis, they don't remember half of what you said. Again, back to that Kubler-Ross curve, they're in complete shock. Only when they come back and they bring somebody else, do you have to repeat the same thing in order for the questions to come. It doesn't happen the way we taught in medical school. You give it, but it's going over my head. I'm still dealing with my emotions. I've just heard you giving me a diagnosis of cancer. I don't actually care what else you're saying after that. I'm dealing with my emotions. So it's about understanding the humanity, the Ubuntu, and then working with that. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, last comment. I thought that was my last, but I think this is a comment from Marquin Matlatuna. We work with love, sensitivity, and passion, and some of us live. However, it's not the profession that we live; it's the system. But that's an important question, discussion for another day. Maybe just your last comments.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you for engaging. I think I've raised more questions than answers, but what is important is the human connection. And as the last comment writes, it's the human connection. It's through human connection that we can have the conversation. There are frameworks, there are agreements, there are ways of doing things. But unless we have a connection, we don't open the road to listen to those that are, or notice the person who's using alcohol to self-medicate. And that's what we need to do. It's not about, and I always use this for people, don't ask people, why are you late? When they walk in, ask what makes you late. Because sometimes it's not when we say why are you late, we come in with a judgmental attitude. One of the people shared, when we asked what makes you late, this nurse said, actually, I've just adopted a child with a disability and I can only come here when that helper comes. So nobody knew that in the facility. Only when we asked the question, did that surface. So it's about making assumptions. Yeah. So thank you. Keep thinking. Schedule time for yourselves to think and grow. And life is all about lifelong learning.
Yeah.
Thank you for your time and for the opportunity.
Definitely. Yeah. No. No, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us. And I think there's a lot that the VUCA, the agreements, and also the Ruiz, the author, and hope that maybe if you then share the presentation, if it's okay, then I think the links, so that we can share the links with all those who had connected this evening, or any other person who might want to connect. So we can share with those that we are not able to watch that video clip that you send us from YouTube.
Yeah.
But I just want to thank you on behalf of Clinics Health Group. Thank you very much for joining us all the way. You know, Zoom is beautiful because you're all the way in the Western Cape and you're with us this evening.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Appreciate
but we
it.
hope that sometime we'll be able to have physical meetings and meet in person once more. But I just want to thank also the colleagues who joined us, more than 230 or so tonight, who logged in for this wonderful presentation, and just to make us to start thinking about where we are and where we want to be. And thanks, colleagues, for logging in, and also to thank Kamo, who's been working with me for all this last year and a half or so, 2 years, and the team from the marketing team, Toko and Anza, and also the head of the unit, Matsepo. and the CEO of the hospital, of the group, Dr. Matseke, for allowing us to have these webinars. And we just want to thank everyone. And we continue meeting. We'll have the last 2 webinars. Next week, we're celebrating World AIDS Day. Then we finish off on the 7th of December. And have a good evening. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.